Barry Forshaw, and I'm the author of Nordic Noir, to be published this March. And what I'm going to offer you now is a 5-minute, not an idiot's guide, but a guide to Scandinavian crime fiction. By the end of these 5 minutes, you'll know everything there is to know about Scandinavian crime fiction. It starts with people who were not read today. Maria Lang, Stig Tranter, who were very big in their day, and she was published in Britain. She's kind of like the Scandinavian Agatha Christie. But there is a couple. And the couple who really launched it are called Sjöwall and Wahlöö. And everyone, but everyone, who writes Scandinavian crime fiction regards them as the most important people. They are immensely influential. They were Marxists. They created a detective called Martin Beck. And without Martin Beck, there would be no Kurt Wallander. Then, of course, we have Kurt Wallander. Now, Henning Mankell, when Henning Mankell came along, he was the Trojan horse for Scandinavian crime fiction. His books had started to get reviewed before there was a Scandinavian wave. But we all fairly quickly fell in love with Kurt Wallander, who is middle-aged, paunchy, diabetic, has difficulties holding down a relationship, has difficulties with his daughter, so everything really a modern couple should be. The books are supremely well written. They're very socially committed, and that's to some degree what Henning Mankell took from Sjöwall and Wahlöö. There is definitely a left-wing approach to society. And all of these books are about how the ideal social democracy we all think exists in Sweden and in the Scandinavian countries is maybe not quite as hunky-dory as we think it is. We have, of course, 3 versions of Wallander on television. One of them is called Wallander. We have the original actor called Rolf Lassgård, who was selected by Henning Mankell himself, who's very good, a large, bear-like individual. Then there's Christer Henriksson, the most people's favourite, the Swedish Wallander. And of course we have Wallander, played by Kenneth Branagh. Personally, I don't know why his name couldn't be Wallander, but there you go, he's Wallander. All 3 series are very different, and all 3 series have something to offer, but most people would opt for Christer Henriksson as their most, as the favourite Wallander. Henning Mankell's social commitment has led to the fact that he was arrested along with a lot of other people during the attempt to break the Gaza blockade. He was on the flotilla. I asked him if the Israeli troops knew who he was, and he said, "You can damn well be sure they knew." And I think it's this social conscience that energizes his writing. Another important writer from that country, from Sweden, is Håkan Nesser, who is somewhat different, slightly more left of centre in his politics, but a very important writer, and gradually his books are starting to appear over here now. And then, of course, we have the women, people like Karin Fossum. Karin Fossum is to some degree the Scandinavian Ruth Rendell, very dark, bleak view of humanity, beautifully written books, and the translations tend to do justice to her. And then perhaps we come to the biggie, which is a man who was dead at the age of 50, who wrote 3 massive blockbuster novels before he died, and although there were stories about how he died, that the far right had been responsible for his death, it isn't true. We're talking, of course, about Stieg Larsson, and we're talking about Lisbeth Salander and the girl with the dragon tattoo. And I remember being asked at an embassy event, sitting next to his editor, what were the 3 things that had made him so successful. I think I would identify them with the fact that he was dead at 50, he was dead as a young man, not because of the far right, but because of his journalistic habits, because of his love of junk food, because of his 60-a-day habit, and the fact that he really kind of abused his body. But he managed to write this terrific trilogy. It's baggy, maybe it needs tighter editing, it's a controversial book in terms of the fact that it's not always well written. It's not a literary book, and it's interesting because it came from a literary publisher, but it is more a blockbuster along the lines of other more popular blockbusters. We have at the centre of those books a disgraced journalist, but what we really have is Lisbeth Salander. Now, Lisbeth Salander is not unique. There were women like her before, but to take a sociopathic, multiply sexually abused goth heroine who is also something of a computer whiz, also has an almost superhero-like way of dealing with men much larger than her. She was something we'd never encountered before. And of course we had 2 very good film versions that followed, which consolidated the success of the books. We have other writers who've made an impression, like Rosalind and Hellstrom. They're an interesting duo. They are a criminologist and a criminal, or ex-criminal, and they met together when working on various programs, and they write tough, hard-hitting books, as does you see also similarly grim and dark books. In fact, there's quite a lot of dark Scandinavian crime fiction. There are books by a writer called Jens Lapidus, who is in fact a criminal lawyer and writes books which show the criminal underworld. They're very different from people like Henning Mankell. We talked about The Killing at great length at various things, but we have to talk about it now. Now, The Killing is kind of the breakthrough in many ways for Scandinavian crime fiction, both in terms of the fact that there is now a series of books written by David Hewson, but the British fell in love. They absolutely fell in love with Sarah Lunt, the heroine of The Killing, and that love affair has continued ever since. She was something new. We'd seen male cops who let their private life go to hell. Nothing quite like her before. Also, it was a show that took its time, intelligently written by Søren Sveistrup, and it was a kind of breakthrough. And it was followed by another Danish drama from the same production company, which maybe isn't a thriller, but is a political thriller, and that's Borgen. And that is, of course, a Danish political thriller, but it has a lot of the elements of the crime thrillers, and there's no denying it's not part of that incredible wave. We have to also talk about The Bridge. That's the holy trinity of the drama shows. Saga Noren, who is the heroine of The Bridge, she almost makes Lisbeth Salander look like a normal, functioning human being. She is so sociopathic. It's almost over the edge, but she's a fascinating character and very well played in that series. There are a lot more series coming along, like Unit 1, which was made earlier. We should talk about other countries. We should talk about Iceland. That's quite easy. There is a king and queen of Iceland. There is Arnaldur Indridason and Yrsa Sigurdardóttir. They are the king and queen who wrote tremendous books, particularly Yrsa. She's very popular. She's basically a kind of horror writer who is disguised as a crime writer. Her books are rather dark and disturbing. And like a lot of people in Iceland, she holds down two jobs. She's also a civil engineer. There's a lot more names still appearing. There's a writer called Anna Holt, or Anne Holt, whose character is a lesbian police chief, very unusual character. The books read like a very modern version of Agatha Christie. And perhaps we should finish on the man who is certainly the current king of Scandinavian crime fiction. This is a man who was a rock star. He was a footballer. He's had several careers. He is Joe Nesbø, of course. He used to be called Jørn Nesbø, but his publishers have decided that we should now anglicize him and call him Joe Nesbø. And he is so comfortably at the top of the tree in the crime writing stakes. Nobody can touch him at the moment. Martin Scorsese may be filming The Snowman shortly, and there have been several films of his books. In fact, he's the only crime writer in the world at the moment whose name appears as part of the title of the film, Joe Nesbø's Headhunter. I'm usually asked, what is going to follow Scandinavian crime fiction? What's the next country? The answer for the moment is Scandinavia. There is nothing on the horizon, although there's very good writing coming from Germany and Italy and France, but for some time yet it's the Scandinavians.